and that he would give him a land and family. And he has jumped the gun and tried to, instead of waiting on God to provide the heir, he and Sarai have jumped the gun and brought Hagar into the picture, and Hagar has now had Ishmael, and they tried to produce an heir on their own outside of the God's intention. So instead of waiting for God to provide an heir through Sarah, Abram and Sarai jumped the gun and try to produce an heir through Hagar. And as we said last time, that creates all kinds of issues in the future for them. But after they have done this, after they have jumped the gun, and now Hagar is pregnant with Ishmael, and then Ishmael is born, God returns to Abram and renews the covenant. Basically, Abram has obviously started to doubt the promise, or this wouldn't have happened. And so now God comes and renews the promise with Abram and makes the covenant with him again. And this time, when God's talking about the covenant, there's some extra stuff to it, extra details added to it, but it also comes with a kind of caveat that the people, Abraham's descendants, have to honor the covenant by taking the mark of the covenant. And then later there'll also be some stuff about obedience to the law and obedience to God's commands. Now, it still all rests on this earlier covenant that had no caveats, no promises, nothing on Abraham's behalf. But the blessing and abundance and gifts and prosperity, that all God starts to make the prosperity and abundance and enjoyment of life stuff more dependent on their obedience and their willingness to follow the covenant. And so God will still keep the basic promise to provide them with land and descendants and to make them a blessing to all nations, regardless of what they do. But the long life and enjoyment of the land and the prosperity and the wealth all is tied up with their obedience. So God comes and renews this covenant, makes this covenant with them again, and reiterates all the various parts of the covenant. But there's an extra detail now. God tells Abraham that he and his son and his children have to be, his sons after him and all the men in his household have to be circumcised. Does everybody know what circumcision is? Yeah? Everybody? Like, really? Because if you don't know, I got to explain it, and I would love to have one class in my history here that I didn't have to explain it. Oh, no. This is the lecture I'm recording, and so if there's anybody in the other class, I still have to. Well, you get to hear the explanation of circumcision even if you already know what it is. Circumcision is a kind of a surgical process or surgical operation where an incision is made all the way around the circumference of a man's penis, and some excess foreskin is cut off. And it's still performed today. If you go to the hospital, your pediatrician will perform circumcision if you ask him to on newborn. And it's become much less common now than it was to be done even like 50 years ago. But it's still relatively common, and people still now will be circumcised. But for Abraham, for his day, it was not super common, and in fact the reason that it's common now dates back to this story, to this moment. And so God tells Abraham that he is to circumcise himself and his son and all the other people in his household, all the other men in the household. And all of their descendants from that day forward are to be circumcised. All the males in their households are to be circumcised, whether they are natural born or they are servants that are serving in the house. However they get there, however they come into the household, all males in the household of Abraham's descendants should be circumcised. And if they don't, then they're to be cut off because they have rejected the covenant. And so circumcision becomes the sign of the covenant, and to have circumcision is a mark or a sign that you belong to this covenant with Abraham, that God makes with Abraham. And if anybody, you're real curious about why God chooses this, I can give you some speculation after class if you really want to know, but it's all speculation. God doesn't explain why choose the mark of circumcision and not say, literally anything else anywhere else in the body. Why this? There's no explanation, but this is the sign, the mark that they're given, the sign of circumcision. And so Abraham immediately goes and circumcises his son Ishmael and himself and all the other men in his household. All the servants and other men that are there are circumcised. And God also in this conversation, when he promises Abraham that he will have a son, Abraham's initial reaction is to say, well, that doesn't seem likely, and to laugh at the idea that he at nearly 100 years old and his wife Sarah at nearly 90 years old, that they're going to have a child together. And so he laughs at that idea and then tries to talk God into blessing Ishmael instead, to let Ishmael be the child that he fulfills the promise through. And God tells Abraham that he will make Ishmael into a great nation, but that's not the nation that he's going to fulfill this promise through. That God will take care of Ishmael and that he will be numerous as well, but God is going to give him a son through Sarah, and that is where the promise will be fulfilled. And in this conversation, he also changes Abram's name to Abraham, and tells him that he's no longer Abram, but Abraham, or Abraham. And the name change there, the meaning changes from exalted father to father of a multitude. And that's the name change. And then Sarai, he also says that she is no longer Sarai, but Sarah. And then he tells him also that he is to name the child that he has with Sarah, Isaac. And the kind of pun or the joke here is that the name Isaac means laughter, because Abraham's first reaction to hearing about the idea of Sarah having a son is to laugh. And as we'll see in the next story, when Sarah finds this out, when Sarah finds out that she's going to have a child, and she hears God say that she is going to have a child in her old age, her first reaction is also to laugh. And so, Isaac, laughter. And then later in the story, we'll also see later in this lecture, hopefully, assuming we get as far as we did in the other class, that her reaction to the birth of Isaac is to laugh, but in a different way, to laugh with joy that God has fulfilled the promise and she now has a son. And she says that all of my friends and family will laugh along with me. And so the name Isaac kind of takes on an extra layer of meaning, not just as a joke at her parents' lack of trust or incredulity at the idea of having children when late, but also at the joy at the moment of his actual coming. When he's born, they're so overjoyed they laugh. And so that God makes this promise and renews this covenant, makes the promise that Sarah will have a son in very soon, and tells him to name him Isaac, and gives the sign of circumcision and changes their names from Abram to Abraham and from Sarai to Sarah. And so finally I can stop bouncing back and forth between saying Sarai, Sarah, and Abram, Abraham, because it gets annoying to me. I don't like it. And so the next chapter then, chapter 18, God comes and speaks to Abraham again in the form of these three men. There's these three guys that are walking down the road or are walking by one day, and Abraham looks up and sees them and quickly invites them in to share a meal and to stay and enjoy hospitality. And he not only offers them a quick snack, he says go and kill a calf and roast it, prepare it, and bake bread. And so they go into preparing a feast, and he brings out milk and curds, and so kind of like proto cheese. So he's brings all this stuff out for them to enjoy, and throws this feast as part of his hospitality. And as he's talking to these visitors, it's clear that they are God, or that they are speaking with the voice of God, and that they are somehow with them there is the presence of God. And so they are in the presence, Abraham is in the presence of the Lord and is speaking to God and with these three visitors. And then a little later in the story, it's that Abraham is speaking, two of them leave, and Abraham is speaking to one and is speaking to the Lord. And so how this all works and how these three men are the representatives of God or are God's presence is kind of mysterious, in kind of the same way that the torch and the blazing torch and the smoking censer from chapter 15 were kind of mysterious and an odd way for God to show up. God keeps showing up in all of these kind of different odd ways as the situation dictates, and we don't always understand why why God chooses that particular way of appearing. But these three men come walking up. He shows them hospitality, and Abraham is aware that he is in the presence of God and is speaking to God. And God once again promises that he will have a son, and that Sarah will have a son on her knee this time next year. And now we get a real specific timeline that by next year she will have a son. And Sarah is in the next tent over, either still working on food preparations or just that's where she is. And she hears God say this, and she laughs. And so, again, the name Isaac is appropriate. But she laughs, and so God says, why is Sarah laughing at the idea that she will have a son? Is anything too hard for God? And Sarah has kind of a panic moment that God has just caught her laughing, and so she tries to cover up and lie about it and say, I didn't laugh. And God's response is, yeah, you did. And then just kind of moves on. It's like no real punishment for having lied. It's just she got called out on it. Yeah, you did. And then two of the men get up and leave and go towards Sodom, towards the town Sodom in the plain, the place where Lot lives. And one of the men remains behind with Abraham, and it is Abraham speaks to this man, and the presence of the Lord is there, and he's speaking to the Lord, and figure that out. We don't know exactly how it relates, but Abraham is speaking to God through this man, and this man stays and tells Abraham what the plan is, what God is about to do. That the two other angelic beings, these two other visitors, have gone down to Sodom, and they are going to make sure or check out the reports that God has heard about the wickedness of Sodom. And if the reports are true, the reports are accurate, destroy the town. And he's going to wipe it out. And Abraham is disturbed by this idea, and so he starts asking, God, you are the righteous judge. You are God, and you are righteous. And so if there are a bunch of good men in the town, if there are a bunch of righteous men in the town, will you still destroy the city? And he starts out and says, if there are 50 righteous men in the town, would you still destroy it? And God says, no, for 50 men I would spare the town. And he says, well, what if there were only 45? If there were 5 less than 50, for the sake of those 5 men, would you still destroy the town? God says, no, for 45 I would spare the town. And then for 40? No, for 40 I'd spare it. 30, spare it. 20, spare it. 10, still spare it. God says, all the way down to 10, God says, yes, still spare the town. And by this point, Abraham is like quaking in his boots at the idea that he's arguing with God. And so he stops. So he just the conversation just ends after he says 10. And then the scene shifts, and now we come to the two men, the two visitors that had gone on into the city. And it turns out they come in, and they walk into the city, they come into the city, and Lot is in the gates of the city. And remember, we talked about Lot just keeps kind of getting more and more interconnected with Sodom, and now he's sitting in the gates where people of influence spend a lot of their time. And so he sees them come in, and the men come in, and they find there's nobody there that offers them hospitality. No one offers them a place to stay. And so they set up to spend the night in the city square. They spend the night just in the open in town. And when Lot comes in from the gate, he sees them there set up in the gate, or in the square, and he offers them to come to stay with him, don't sleep in the square, come and stay in my home. And at first they say, no, we're not going to do that, but he insists, and they come, and he prepares a meal for them, or his wife and family prepare a meal for them, and they eat and get ready to settle in for the night. And about that time, there comes a pounding on the door, and a whole bunch of men from all over Sodom have come up, and they are pounding on this door to get Lot to come out. And when Lot does come out, he slips out, and he closes the door behind him and asks them what they want. And they say, the men that came in to stay with you, bring them out, we want to sleep with them. So basically they say, bring those men out here so we can rape them. And so all the men in the city, or a bunch of men from the city, from all over the city, have come out and gathered around this one house, and are demanding that Lot bring out the guests that have come into his household so that they can rape them. And there's a whole lot of issues around this, but one of them that's not obvious to most people in our generation or our day is the violation of hospitality that this entails. There's all the other potential problems too. Of course, raping anybody's bad, and the total lack of consent or even seeking consent in any form, that they're going to just sexually do what they want with these men. That's a problem, the rape factor. Then also it's homosexuality, definitely not okay in this culture. And so that's a problem. And then there's the violation of hospitality. And the understanding of hospitality would be that Lot has extended his home to these people. And so he, as their host, has accepted some responsibility for them. And so, for example, that they come into his home, he's provided them a meal, they have eaten together and shared together. And so until they leave, he's supposed to care for them and to treat them like family. And this is not just a thing for Lot and his family, it's a broadly recognized obligation for someone at this point in this culture. And it's so broadly recognized, in fact, that Lot uses this as an argument for them not to do the thing that they want to do, is that they are under the protection of my roof. So don't do this evil thing, don't do this wicked thing, and violate hospitality to take these men and abuse them while they're under the protection of my roof. In fact, this hospitality custom is so important to Lot that he says something else that is really, first of all, we've got these group of men saying, bring these guys out so we can rape them. That's already pretty screwed up, right? But we're going to take it another level of screwed up, because Lot's reaction, his response to them wanting to rape the men, is to say, they're under the protection of my roof. Look, I've got 2 virgin daughters. I'll give them to you to do what you want. I got a 5-year-old daughter. There is no power on earth that's going to make me say, here, have my daughter. Okay. I don't know what in the world is going on with Lot here. But he says, I've got 2 daughters. I'll bring them out. Do with them as you wish. And the men aren't interested. They want the 2 men that are inside. They want to rape them. And they even look at Lot and say, this fellow's a foreigner among us, and now he wants to play the judge and tell us what's right and wrong. And if you don't bring those men out, we're coming in. And so he keeps arguing with them for a little bit, and then these 2 men, the angelic figures, reach out through the doorway and jerk Lot back in and slam the door closed, and then they strike the men outside with blindness. None of the men outside can see, and so they kind of grope around, wander around, and they can't find their way into the door. They can't find their way to get in. And the 2 men tell Lot that obviously things are every bit as bad as we've been told, and so God has sent us to destroy this city. And if there's anybody in the town that's connected to you that you want to have spared, you need to get them here, and you need to be gone by morning, because in the morning this town is gone. And so Lot goes out, and there's already been a marriage arranged between his daughters and 2 men in the town. And so he goes out to those 2 men, and as his sons-in-law, or about to be sons-in-law, he begs them to come and to flee the city with him, because God is going to destroy this town. Everything's going to be gone tomorrow. Come with me now, and we'll flee together. But the two young men just laugh at him. They think he's cracked, that he's gone off or something. He's not okay. And so they just laugh at him, and he leaves and comes back to his house, and the sons-in-law don't come. And now it's very close to morning. The angels are saying, you got to go, but they're dragging around because they don't really want to leave. They don't want to leave everything that they've got. They don't want to leave all their stuff, and so they're packing and grabbing belongings, but they just really don't want to go. And finally, the angels physically grab a hold of them, and drag them out and shove them down the road to get them moving. And they tell them, you've got to go and make sure that you don't look back. And Lot, along the way, had argued, and they said that they were going to destroy all the towns of the plain, because all the towns were equally involved in this kind of stuff. It was just Sodom is where they happened to be. And so they were going to destroy all the towns in the plain. And he says, well, there's this one town right at the edge of the plain. There's not many people there. Will you spare that so that we can go there and live there? And the angels agree that they won't destroy this one town, and then shove them down the road to get going, and tell them, make sure that you don't look back. And so they take off down the road, and they're going to this one small town on the edge of the plain right before the mountains. And Lot's wife turns around and looks back. And it's not just kind of a glance to see what's happening kind of thing. It seems to be that she was, she really wanted to go back home. Like she didn't want to have to flee all this, to run away from her home and all the stuff that she had acquired and all the stuff that was important to them there. She didn't want to flee from that, to turn away from that. And so she was looking back with this kind of desire to go back and longing to go back. And she turns into a pillar of salt. It's transformed into a rock formation, or a pillar of salt. And you can actually go to Israel today, and there's a particular rock formation. It's big. It's like 2 stories tall, and it's called Lot's wife, because presumably this is the rock formation that Lot's wife was turned into. And so then it's just Lot and his 2 daughters. So it was Lot and his wife and his 2 daughters, and Lot's wife turns back, looks, and is turned into a pillar of salt. And so now it's just Lot and his 2 daughters that are fleeing to this small town, and they get there, and the text says that Abraham, kind of switch over to Abraham's perspective, and Abraham comes up to the cliff, or to the peak where he was speaking to the Lord the day before, and he looks out and he sees just smoke all over the plains, and all the towns, all the cities of the plain had been destroyed. But Abraham and his 2 daughters get to this town that was spared, and then a little later they leave the town because it's not safe for them to be there, and they end up living in caves in the mountain. And so they're living in this cave in the mountains, and y'all thought that this story was pretty screwed up, right? It's gonna get worse. We still got one more level to go before we're done. So Lot and his daughters are living in this cave, and the daughters one day realize that there are no men around to be their husbands and to give them children to carry on the family line. And so the oldest daughter decides that she's going to, they agree together to get dad drunk, and then the oldest daughter will go in and sleep with him and get pregnant by dad to carry on his family line. And then the next day, they get dad drunk again, and younger daughter goes in to sleep with dad again to carry on the family line. And the text says that dad, Lot, was not aware when they laid down or when they got up. And so he doesn't really know what's happened until daughters come and say, "Hey dad, we're pregnant." But these 2 daughters go in and have an incestuous relationship with their dad and get pregnant in order to carry on his family line. And the 2 sons that come from this relation, these 2 events, to put it as mildly as we can, the 2 sons are named Moab and Ben-Ami. And I wrote Ami really messy there. The name, or these 2 guys become the forefathers, or the progenitors of 2 tribes that become major thorns in Israel's side later, the Moabites and the Ammonites. And so Moab, the tribe Moab, or the Moabites, come from Moab, and the Ammonites come from Ben-Ami. And so this is really messed up situation, really messed up family line, and it leads to these 2 troops, or these 2 tribes, that are going to be major sources of problems for Israel later on. But there's going to be one bright spot that comes out of Moab, but I'll save that for later. And fortunately, thank goodness, this is the end of our concern with Lot in the story. Lot is one of the most confusing, conflicting characters in the Old Testament. He's this constant source of problems. Even though he doesn't seem to be intending badly, he causes lots of problems. Said to the last class, other than Satan himself, I can only think of maybe 1 or 2 other characters that cause more problems than Lot. So that's, but we're done. Fortunately, we're done with Lot. And now we're going to switch back to Abraham's perspective. And so we switch back to Abraham, and this is Genesis chapter 20. And we see that Abraham he hasn't really learned his lesson. He lied about his wife being his sister in Egypt, and then they jumped the gun and tried to get ahead of God's plan and make it happen on their own terms with Hagar. Well, now Abraham is going to repeat the first mistake again, this time with a different king, and he's going to be talking to Abimelech, or traveling into the lands of Abimelech, king of the Philistines. And once again, he's going to try to pass off his wife as his sister. At this point, Sarah is, I mean, unless this story has been put into a place out of chronological order in order to make a point, which is possible. Unless it's been put out of chronological order for some kind of literary purpose or to make a particular point. Sarah is pregnant with Isaac at this point, which means that she's about 90 years old, which you would think mean that probably people aren't going to be willing to kill her husband anymore over her ravishing beauty, right? And not that an older lady can't still be beautiful, but usually men aren't fighting over 90-year-olds. And so there's something odd in that. But Abraham decides that still he needs to sell or to pass off his wife as his sister. And once again, this king takes her into his household and marries her. In this case, though, the king doesn't sleep with her, and he doesn't actually, go to sleep with her, have sex with her, for whatever reason. But a little later, before he does, God comes to him and speaks to Abimelech in a dream and says, "If you touch this woman, you're as good as dead," because she's someone else's wife. And Abimelech says, "Look, I didn't know. I was innocent. Everybody lied to me. I haven't laid a hand on her. I haven't touched her. Abraham said he was his sister. She said he was his sister. And everybody said that she was his sister. I didn't know, I swear." And God says, "I know you didn't know, which is why I'm warning you now. If you lay a hand on her, if you touch her, you and all those who belong to you, all those in your household will die. So give her back to her husband and don't touch her." And so he gets up the next morning, goes and confronts Abraham, is angry with him for what he's done again, and then gives him his wife back. And he gives 1,000 shekels of silver to Rebekah as a kind of an apology, or to take away the stain, or to atone for any insult that was given to her, just as a kind of an apology gift to her, which again is kind of odd because she lied to him, but whatever.
You said Rebecca, you mean Sarah?
Yes, Sarah. Sorry, we haven't gotten to Rebecca yet. That's a little later. But it gives 1,000 shekels of silver to Sarah. Thank you. And gives Abraham the right to settle wherever he wants among his lands. And so he chooses this particular spot called Gerar and settles there. And things go well for a little while, but then there starts to be animosity and problems between Abimelech's people and Abraham's people, and there's a well that ends up being fought over. And later, Abimelech comes and wants to swear an oath, or to make a covenant with Abraham, to make this treaty between him and Abraham, that they will not go to war with each other, because Abimelech seems to realize that God is blessing Abraham, and that if he's not careful, he's got this person that is blessed by a very powerful being, that God is blessing this man, and if he's not careful, he or his descendants are going to find themselves at odds with Abraham's family. And if God is blessing them, then that won't go well for them. And so he makes this treaty with Abraham, and they discuss and deal with the well problem, and they kind of move on. They patch up things. Abraham's big mistake, again, repeating the lying about his wife, ends up working out okay for him. In fact, he ends up settling in Gerar, which is in the land of Canaan eventually, and so he gets his kind of first taste of living in the promised land. And then Isaac is born in chapter 21. Isaac is born, and at his birth there's joy and laughter and celebration, and so the name Isaac is very appropriate. And then a little while later, a couple of years later probably, Isaac is old enough, he's being weaned, which means he's no longer going to be drinking breast milk anymore, and he's fully separated from mom. And so they decide to throw this great big feast. And this would have been not uncommon at the time, because infant mortality was really high in the ancient world. And lots of diseases, lots of things could cause an infant to die, and it was actually relatively common that people wouldn't even give their child a name until a certain age, until they were like a year old or so, because there was a significant chance that the child was going to die in the first year of life, and you don't want to waste a name, apparently, or it just wasn't. It was so common for an infant to die that they didn't name them until they were a year old. And so they decide to throw this great big feast for the weaning of Isaac, that he's gotten old enough that he's fully separated from mom, he's not drinking breast milk anymore, he's gotten past this age where all these different things happen, where babies can die. fairly frequently, and so they're throwing this party that he's gotten that far. And in the midst of this celebration, Sarah looks out and sees Ishmael. And when she looks out, she sees Ishmael, and she says that he is mocking. And what he was mocking, who he was mocking is unclear. It doesn't say that he was mocking Isaac or that he was mocking Sarah, that he was mocking anybody in particular. He's probably somewhere between 7 and 10 years old at this point, somewhere around in there, and he's mocking something. He's making fun of something, and it really bothers Sarah. It makes her angry, and so that jealousy between her and Hagar gets stirred back up, and so she goes to Abraham and says, "This slave woman and her son have got to go. He is not Ishmael. This slave woman's son will not inherit with my son. So you've got to send him away." And Abraham is very disturbed by this development, by his wife being this upset and wanting him to send his son away, because Ishmael is his son, even if it's not by Sarah. And so he's disturbed by this, but then God tells him to go ahead and do what Sarah asked, and that God is going to take care of Ishmael and Hagar, and he will become a great nation as well. But it's through Sarah that his line, that the promise will be fulfilled. So he does. He gives Hagar a bundle of food and a water skin, and sends her and Ishmael off into the desert, which is, again, a choice that I can't conceive making. This is like on the lines with Lot and his daughters. I can't imagine handing my daughter over to do whatever with. I also can't imagine sending my son off with his mother into the desert with a skin of water and saying, "Bye, hope for the best." But that's what he does, and God told him that he would take care of Ishmael. But again, this is a result of Abraham's really poor choices. That he tried to pass off his wife as his sister in Egypt. That's where they ended up acquiring Hagar, and then that he didn't stand up for the mother of his child, Hagar, in that first interaction, and he's failed to do it again. He doesn't stand up for her here, and now Hagar and Ishmael are gone. Well, as they're sent away, Hagar and Ishmael, they travel out in the desert, and the water runs out. They run out of water, and Hagar realizes that their situation is really desperate. In fact, they're going to die. And she lays her son down in the shadiest spot that she can find, and she wanders off a little further and turns her back and sits down because she can't bear to watch her son die. And so he's laying behind her a little ways away while she has her back turned to him, and she's just weeping. And an angel comes and speaks to her and reminds her of the promise that God had made before, and that God would take care of them and make Ishmael into a great nation, and then shows her the spring of water that was nearby that she had missed, hadn't seen. And so she goes, refills the water skin, and gives him, Ishmael and herself, something to drink. And then we get kind of a summary of most of the rest of Ishmael's life at the end of this chapter. And Ishmael, Hagar finds a wife for him from among Egyptians, and then they end up settling in the land east of the Nile. And he and his descendants his descendants are very numerous, and the tribes of his descendants are always at odds with the tribes of the rest of his family, of Isaac and others. And we mentioned the other day that if you pay attention and you look, the Quran traces Muhammad's line back to Ishmael, and of course Judaism traces all of Israel's line back through Isaac, and so you can look and see even now the conflict between Jewish people, Muslim people in the Middle East, and the two races involved there. So very long-standing conflict. Thousands of years later, we're still dealing with the same conflict that was started by this series of screw-ups on Abraham's part. But Ishmael lives, and this is really the last time that we're dealing with Ishmael in the Old Testament, except for briefly Ishmael will come back, and Isaac and Ishmael together will bury Abraham after Abraham dies. So that's that's the end of our story for Ishmael. And then in the next chapter, chapter 22, we have one of the more difficult texts in the Old Testament for a lot of people. So it's kind of a why this? Why did God do this? In fact, one of you responded for today online. Your question was, why did God do this? And so we'll hopefully by the end at least have something of an answer. But in chapter 22, God tells Abraham to take his son, Isaac, and phrases it even as, take your son, your only son, whom you love, and sacrifice him to me on a mountain that I will show you. And so Abraham is supposed to take and load up his son and everything that he needed to make a sacrifice and take him and his son and go to this mountain somewhere a few days away and build an altar and sacrifice his son on the top of it. And Abraham agrees, or doesn't really agree, he just starts packing up to go. And he starts loading up everything that he would need. And he doesn't tell anybody where he's going for real or what he's intending to do. He just tells them that he is going with his son, with the son, to worship on the mountain. And he and a few servants and Isaac and Abraham take off, and they travel a few days away, and they get to the foot of the mountain that they're going to go on, and he leaves the servants behind, and he puts all of the wood for the offering, the altar, the sacrifice on Isaac's back, and he carries the sacrificial knife and the flame to start the fire with. And they start climbing up the mountain. And again, nobody knows anything about the plan, what's going on. They're going on the mountain to worship. And Isaac, obviously, one key thing to note here is that Isaac is carrying the wood up the mountain. How old is a young man or a boy that can carry a whole load of wood on his back up a mountain? We're not talking about like a 6-year-old here, right? This is a young man. This is at least in his teens, early teens, and maybe a little older, somewhere probably at least 12 up to 16, 17 years old. And so he's a fairly strong kid, and he's walking up the mountain with his now well over 100-year-old dad. And as he's climbing up the mountain, he looks around and obviously got a head on his shoulders, and he says, "Dad, I see the wood, and I see the knife and the flame for the sacrifice. I see all these things. Where is the sacrifice?" And Abraham replies and says, "The Lord will provide a sacrifice, son. The Lord will provide the sacrifice." And so they finish climbing up the mountain. They get to the top and they start to arrange the sacrifice. They build the altar. They lay out the wood to burn the sacrifice after it's slaughtered. And Abraham lays his son out on the altar. Now, this is why I bring up the age for Isaac and that he carries the wood up the mountains. Isaac is an old enough and strong enough young man that he can carry this load of wood up a mountain. Abraham is well over 100 years old. Abraham's not doing anything to Isaac without his permission, right? You got a strong young man and an older man. The older man is not doing anything to him without his permission. And so Isaac allows himself to be laid out on the altar and his arms bound like he is a sacrifice. And Abraham takes the knife for the sacrifice to slaughter, and he takes the knife and he's raising it up and just about to strike down to kill his son when God speaks audibly and says, "Abraham, Abraham, stop. Don't harm the boy." And God goes on to say that this shows that now it's clear. Now I know you fear God, and so don't lay a hand on the boy. And renews or repeats the covenant again, that God will make him a blessing to all people and that his descendants will be numerous. And that this scene is kind of disturbing. Hang on, we'll go back to that. Then Abraham and his son turn and look, and they're caught in a thicket nearby, and some brambles or bushes nearby is this ram that's gotten its horns tangled up in the thicket and it can't get away. And so here on the top of the mountain, all of a sudden there's this animal suitable for sacrifice. And so they go and they take the ram and they lay it on the altar and they sacrifice it and offer it to God. And then Abraham names this mountain, he gives it a name, and the English translation is "the Lord will provide," which is Yahweh Jireh or Jehovah Jireh, as some of you in different churches may have heard it, but Yahweh Jireh is the Hebrew. And the Lord will provide. And the text says that to this day, so as of the date of the writing of Genesis, several hundred years later, it is said, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." And so the whole scene, or the conclusion of this, seems to be that there's this trust that God provides. But that's still, kind of brings us there's this question, why does God tell Abraham to do this? There's nowhere else in the Old Testament that you'll find that God is even neutral towards human sacrifice. God abhors human sacrifice everywhere else. In fact, he condemns the Israelites for practicing human sacrifice much later in their career, much later in their relationship with God. When they make sacrifices to other gods, and some of them require human sacrifices, and they sacrifice their own children. And he has Israel go to war against and destroy other nations that practice human sacrifice. God obviously hates human sacrifice everywhere else, but in this one story, he tells Abraham to sacrifice his son. Why? And that's always kind of the question and the idea that God would require this of Abraham, and even put him through this, as hard as it would be, is disturbing to a lot of people, and myself included, because I have a 7-year-old son, and I can imagine myself in this situation. What would I be going through? What would I feel like if God told me to do this? But there's a couple of things that I can't give you a full explanation of why God does anything, really. I can only give you my partial explanation and how I've seen over time at least come to see that God could have a reason that I can understand, or that God is wise for doing something that at first seemed to me either foolish or wrong. In this case, I can say that I, as pastor, have to give advice to some people fairly frequently, and as I'm giving one piece of advice that I have to give fairly frequently is to not look at tests or trials or difficulties as God giving you something to see what you will do, because God already knows what you will do. God already knows what the outcome is going to be. It's not that God is testing you in order to find out how much you know or how faithful you'll be or what you're really like. God gives you these tests in order to shape who you are, to actually mold you into something. And so it's kind of like tempering. If you've ever seen the making of metal goods like a sword or something like that, there's a step in the process that once you have shaped the metal, you've gotten it into its final shape. There's a tempering process, and if you don't do that tempering process, the metal will be very brittle, and that tempering process usually is done by heating up the metal to a really extremely high temperature and then cooling it off either very quickly or relatively slowly, depending on the metal and what you want in the end. And if you don't do that, then the metal is extremely brittle, easy to break, and if you do that, then it's much more durable. And so this testing of Abraham and the testing that God does for other people that every Christian goes through, the difficulties and the testing that seems like we go through, is not just to find out what we'll do. God knows what we'll do. God knows the outcome before we do, way before we do. But we wouldn't become what we are if we didn't have those things happen. And in this case, Abraham is struggling, obviously, to trust God with his future, to trust God with fulfilling this promise. I mean, he leaves his family on the basis of God's promise, but then immediately lies about his wife because he's afraid that God won't protect him through a situation. And so he lies about his wife in Egypt being his sister, and he doesn't trust God. And then he runs off and rescues Lot, and so God renews the promise and makes this covenant with him again, and then he immediately turns around after receiving that promise and sleeps with Hagar because he's afraid that God will not give the heir through his wife Sarah as he promised. And then God renews the covenant again and gives him the sign of circumcision. And a little while later, he's running off with Abimelech and telling again that his wife is his sister, and again afraid God won't protect him through a situation. And so then he sends Ishmael away after the birth of Isaac. And so now here we are. Ishmael is gone. Abraham has only one son left to him, only one son that could possibly be the fulfillment of the promise. And so God puts him in a situation where he has to choose either to keep the son or to give him back. The son, who is the only vehicle, the only means by which God could possibly fulfill the promise to Abraham, God says, sacrifice him to me. Offer back to me the promises, all the hope, all the promises that I've given you over the years. Sacrifice him to me. And at the last second, God has him to stop because he doesn't. And so Abraham has to lay everything on the line, has to lay the fulfillment of all the promises, everything that he's hoped for. He has to lay it on the line in order to do this. And he has to demonstrate, he has to trust God. And it's not just that he has to show that he trusts God, he actually has to do it and put it on the line before he will trust God this way, before he can fully trust God. And it ends up being exactly what Abraham needs. If you look at the rest of the story, Abraham isn't angry with God for putting him through this, for causing him to all the anxiety that led up to this moment. He is thankful to God, gives praise to God, and says, the Lord provides. And so there's this ends up being, this is exactly what Abraham needs. Even though it is horrible sounding to me, at least as a father, it sounds terrible, but yet it ends up being exactly what Abraham needs. And Abraham's response is, God provides. And so his trust in God is deepened through this. And later you come to the New Testament, and the New Testament will refer back to this moment and talk about Abraham as the one that was the progenitor of faith, the father of all those who have faith, and that Abraham was counted righteous by God. He was given righteousness by God because of his trust, and that it was through his faith in God that he was counted righteous, even before the law came. And that of course has very important implications for Christians and whatnot. And there's also, as we talked about last time, typological interpretation, seeing the connections between a story and Christianity, Jesus in the New Testament. This is another one of those stories with a deep typological interpretation, because again we have a son, the son of a man, who is going to be offered as a sacrifice on a mountain, and at the very last minute God offers a substitutionary sacrifice. There's a ram in the thicket, a substitute sacrifice, and so the son is preserved. And yet you come to the New Testament, and again you have a son who is walking up a mountain with a load of wood on his back. In Jesus' case it's a cross, and he climbs the mountain with wood on his back, and he is offered there as a sacrifice, as he is offered as a substitute for all others. And so he carries a load of wood up his back and is offered as a sacrifice on the mountaintop as a substitution for others. So that's, again, kind of a typological interpretation of the story, what happens with Jesus. Now Isaac is, Abraham after this is getting older, and so he sends his most trusted servant to go back to Abraham's family's land and find a wife for his son Isaac. And this servant travels, and he arrives there with this train of camels carrying all these gifts that are to be given to the bride-to-be's family as part of the customs for arranging the marriage of the day. And he prays and asks God to give him a sign who this young woman is. And he says, let this young woman offer me a drink of water from her jug when I ask, and not only give me water, but give water to all of my camels as well. He's going to this well, and as he's approaching it, after having prayed this prayer, this young woman, Rebecca, comes up, and he asks for a drink of water. She gives him something to drink from her jar, and then says, I'll water your camels as well, which was a significant undertaking. It takes lots of trips to water a camel. They drink a ton of water after they have gotten dried out a little bit. And so this was not like quick, here, I'll pour your dog bowl full on my way back home. She had to make lots of trips back and forth to the well to fill this trough up enough for these camels to drink. And so the servant is overjoyed that God has given him success in his mission, and so he gives Rebecca this gold nose ring and several gold bracelets, all this gold jewelry as thanks, and then asks, who is your family? Turns out that she is the son of Bethuel, the son of Nahor, the son of Terah. And if you remember, Abraham is also the son of Terah. And so this woman, Rebecca, when you figure it all out, Isaac and Rebecca are first cousins once removed. Still, this is kind of seems like a little too close to be getting married, but remember, Abraham and Sarah are half brother and sister, and so first cousin once removed is actually kind of a step in the right direction for the family. We're branching the family tree a little more. And Rebecca comes back, and Isaac, she and Isaac get married, and she gets pregnant after Isaac prays for her. Originally, she can't have children. She can't get pregnant. And then Isaac prays for her. She gets pregnant. She becomes pregnant with twins. And we'll pick up next time with the story of those twins, Esau and Jacob. That's it. We're out of time. And we'll see you all on Friday.